The hush money trial is giving us a window into the shady ways Trump world does business. Should you bring this up as a way to convince your friends to vote for Biden? And if so, how should you talk about it? At least 4 members of the Supreme Court would have us believe that a president's lack of immunity has actually been a glaring problem for the past 2.5 centuries, and we're just now noticing. Democrats are about to save a Republican speaker from the far-right crazies, and we think that's actually kind of inspiring, and we should talk about it every chance we get. Finally, we'll talk through how we feel about the student protests on campuses across America. Welcome back to the podcast for the 54% of Americans who regularly vote for progress in every election and want to convince their friends and family members to join our majority. This is Majority 54.
All right, Jason, we just entered the 3rd week of this Trump trial that's going on in New York City, and we started the week off with Judge Merchan holding President Trump, former President Trump, in contempt and fining him $9,000 for repeatedly violating a gag order. He also threatened jail time if the violations continue. I think that latter part is obviously more important. $9,000 is nothing to Trump. There's been a ton of different activity in this court. In particular, there are just witness after witness now. This is, obviously for people you've watched enough legal procedurals to know that it starts with opening statements. And then the prosecutor presents their case, which is the stage that we're at right now. And they're trying to sort of methodically detail the business records pieces of this, like what money was sent to Michael Cohen, what shell company did he set up, et cetera, and just trying to establish both the money trail, number one, which I think is the easiest thing to establish. 2 is that it was done at the direction of Trump, which we haven't seen enough of that yet. Well, I imagine we'll see more of that in the next week or two. And then 3rd is that there was a nexus between this and campaign activities, which we've already seen a little bit of. When we talked about Pecker last week, for example, that was what that was all about. And then Trump's team gets a chance to present their defense, and then the prosecution gets a chance to issue a rebuttal, and then they go to closing arguments, and then the jury will issue a verdict. So this is real.
Yeah, it's truly, really happening. What stands out to me about it is how systematic the process seems to have been for Trump and Trump world to do this. And I don't just mean look, there were clearly, most likely, other hush money situations. I mean, we already know that there's Stormy Daniels, there's Ms. McDougal. But so it's not just that they seem to have a system for doing this. It's the total lack of concern that they seem to have for the fact that they were coloring so far outside the lines, that they were doing things that were not legal, were not ethical. And even if they could convince themselves that they were legal, they knew that they were things that they would not want anyone to know about. And to me, that's what stands out, not as a surprise. It's clearly not a surprise, but to see it explained and played out illustrates to me that if you are, and it's debatable as to whether it's useful in this election, but if you are going to talk to persuadable voters who you are in your social orbit about Trump's character, I feel like this sort of thing is the way to do it, is to demonstrate that, look, it's not that he had an affair with a porn star. Those aren't the things. It's that there was a system for cover up, and they do this sort of thing without a second thought. To my point really is that if you just look at the way the guy operates and that his world operated, he's just a gangster. He always has been. And I feel like that's sort of what this is revealing. It's the organized crime, casual approach to the law that he has always taken.
Yeah, when we do the arena communications director track, where we train, we've trained now hundreds of communications directors from around the Democratic Party, right? And one of the main things we teach really early on when it comes to just crafting a message is that Democrats tend to think too much with rationality. Like, we want to convince somebody through logic to support a candidate. And that just generally doesn't work very well. And even if people tell you they're acting logically, there's so much evidence that what people are doing is acting emotionally. And the Republicans have tended to be very good at using emotion to override our sense of logic, right? And Democrats, I think that's icky politics, right? And so we always say craft messages that are resonant. And resonant could be resonant inspirational, like Obama was really good at, and at times Bill Clinton was too. Or it could be resonant in a negative way. Like you could scare people into like saying, hey, this person is actually, you should fear them. You should fear what they have to offer. But there are many different ways to resonate. And I think in this election, I think there's so much talk about the head part. What are the job numbers? What are the pocketbook issues? Is this candidate going to help you or not? It's important to win those issues, but you have to tack on the resonance. And I think in the case of Trump and this trial, I do think that there is an element of embarrassment, which is a sort of a genre of resonance. Like people still by and large are patriots. And I don't think this is going to be the overriding emotion that Biden should be attaching to his arguments for, his closing arguments. But I do think it's an important one where there are parents out there in the suburbs who are going to be key deciders. There are going to be key constituencies of color who are very devout. There are a lot of people who, on a resonant level, when they see somebody who very clearly paid off at least one porn star, and who might have a criminal charge that's already been, he's already been convicted of, and many more to come. And then they are reminded of the ways he talks, both about the country and our allies. I think that's an opportunity to tack some resonance onto this and to move people with emotion. In this case, a more negative emotion,
Yeah, and let's be honest, it may not move people to Biden, but it might move conservative voters to the Libertarian Party or to RFK Jr. or to not vote. Who knows? Or it could simply be that, yeah, they're still going to vote for Trump, but by talking to them about these things, you've got them at a place where they're not going to volunteer. They're not going to give money. They're not going to talk to their friends about it. They're going to be quiet about it. There's a lot of reasons to continue it. Now, I still think that the best and most resonant arguments are about policy, but let's be honest, a lot of that won't come up in conversation. People do want to talk about the salacious stuff, or they want to throw something at you about Biden and you're not going to be able to resist because that's all BS. The so-called Biden corruption stuff, you're not going to be able to resist throwing this. I'm just saying, if you're going to talk about it, you talk about it as, look at the pattern and practice of how they worked. Like, he's a gangster and this is how he did things. And he had no regard for other people. I mean, you can't help but just marvel at the fact that the guy tried to play the victim outside of court by being like, I can't believe I have to be here on my wife's birthday, instead of like, I can't believe I have to be here at my trial for paying off people who I had extramarital affairs with and lied about and still lie about on my wife's birthday. I mean, I just, like, all over the place. It's an evident lack of character. And
well,
anyway,
a trivial detail. Trump is actually going to be attending Barron's high school graduation.
Oh, they decided to let him.
Surprise there. He complained all about it, complained to the refs, got what he wanted anyway. Surprise, surprise. Now, in more serious, at least in the Barron part of this,
you know what? I'm glad, actually, because
I mean,
for all I know, Barron is a perfectly, like, against all odds, he may be a great kid, and he deserves to have his family at his high school graduation. So, look, that's nice.
Every kid deserves the benefit of the doubt. When he becomes an adult, we'll evaluate his behavior using a different standard. Right now, he's just a child, right? Mm-hmm. Now, okay, this case, like last week in sort of blizzard of other news, on Thursday, the Supreme Court heard oral arguments in Trump versus the United States. This is the immunity case. And there was a lot of sort of reading the tea leaves of the oral arguments, which, as we know, is not always indicative of where folks are going. But I think the consensus here seems to be that the conservative majority on the court, at the very least, is going to carve out some immunity for Trump, which, as I'll get to, is not totally surprising. But the question is how much immunity they're going to carve out for him. And it's anybody's guess, but I think this is just going to further delay the case. That's my big takeaway. Is they're going to the most likely outcome is they're going to say anything in his official capacity as president, and they'll define what official capacity is off limits. Anything that's in his personal capacity is not. The lower courts have to hold hearings and yada 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 to determine what those are, and it's just going to kick this can down the road. That's what seems to be occurring here.
And kicking the can down the road seems to be the main objective. And
Yes.
and so in order to get there, you have to find some necessary further finding of fact or of legal finding. There has to be a reason to do that, because I think even, the most Gorsuches of Gorsuches, or whatever, I don't know who the most crazy conservative is there now, Amy Coney Barrett or whoever, even they probably can't look at this and say, well, yeah, that makes sense. Presidents should be immune from everything all the time, right? Even they can't get there. So they have to try and find some matter that is still in dispute, that needs to be clarified, that needs to be re-argued, so they can send that back down to the court. Because I don't have any doubt that whether they say it out loud or not to each other, their objective, it's pretty unspoken, they don't need to talk about it, is to make sure this happens after the election. This trial happens after the election. And so in order to get there, you have to find some sort of legal question that needs to be answered and needs to be briefed further. So that's why they're asking all these questions about, well, what counts as an official act and what doesn't? And you have this absurd stuff where it's like, well, if the president were to sign as a person an affidavit trying to help certify a fake elector, well, that might not be an official act. Whereas if he were, or that might be an official act. Whereas if he, I can't even keep track. I think it's that they were saying that would possibly be an official act. But then if he calls like the head of the Republican Party or another Republican elected official and asks them to do something, that's more as a candidate. So that's more on the private side. And then they even asked, well, what if the president orders, if the president tries to stage a military coup and is unsuccessful? And they said, well, it depends on the circumstances as to whether that's an official act. And what kills me about all this is like, they're having to work so hard to find a reason as to why this needs to be settled, why this is justiciable at all. And in order to get there, you have to, without them ever saying it, you have to accept the premise that for like 250 years, we've been operating one way and have never run into this problem, have never run into like, oh, wait a second, should the president be above the law? We've just always said one of the great things about America is the president is not above the law. And now somehow 250 years later, a group of people who say that the Constitution should not be widely interpreted in a way that takes into account modern environments. It's just originalism and what's on the page. Now they're like, the people who wrote the Constitution, they had a real blind spot, which is they forgot to create some immunities for the president of the United States. And it turns out that 44 presidents, we won't say 45 because Biden's term isn't over, but like 44 presidents in a row, we didn't seem to have this dispute in any real way. I guess you could say Nixon, but that worked itself out. And also, he didn't even claim that sort of stuff until he was out of office and doing media interviews. But like, it worked fine for 44 administrations, but it turns out it was just sitting there waiting on us, lying in the weeds the whole time, this huge glaring error. And that's just so silly. And they're having to pretend that that's a real thing in order to get us to December.
Yeah, I mean, there's the amount of sort of hypocrisy that was on display during this hearing is mind-blowing. Like Kavanaugh insinuating that Jack Smith is politically motivated and all that, when Kavanaugh sort of cut his teeth in the Ken Starr special counsel investigations of Bill Clinton. The fact that Thomas is even on this panel and hasn't been forced to recuse himself. The fact that they're saying like the assumption is that the Congress impeachment power is how you deal with most law breaking from the president. And In a sane world, that would be true. But if people remember, one of the reasons why many members of Congress gave for not impeaching and convicting Trump on the January 6th stuff was because he was leaving office.
Yeah.
So what they're saying is you can try to stage a coup. If you're unsuccessful, there's no remedy because we're not going to impeach you for it. If you're successful, you've staged a coup. What does it even matter? It's like I do think we have a flaw in the system here.
Yes.
You know.
Yeah. No, it's a great point. It's a great point. Well, it's, you know, as some other people have brought up, it's okay if the mechanism here is impeachment and removal. What about when a federal judge like skims money or takes bribes? If they're not impeached and removed by the Congress, can they not be prosecuted? It doesn't make any sense. It's a completely ridiculous notion. Especially their insinuation here is that if something is not done to define a private act versus, you know, the act in their official duties, then we will have this problem of federal prosecutors constantly prosecuting presidents for their policy decisions. The example they give is that prosecutors would prosecute Biden for his policies because they allow people to illegally cross the border. And it's like, first of all, I don't even understand how a prosecutor would get that past a grand jury. But if they did, I don't see how it makes it the distance. I don't see how it makes it through the appellate process. And second, it again assumes that this has been a glaring problem and just no federal prosecutor in the history of the country has ever thought to do it. It's just make up stuff. They're just making it up.
I was left thinking in listening to these oral arguments that I'm glad the question is being asked. Now, I don't think this is the right way to ask it and answer it, but it is an important question to ask, which is, what is sovereign immunity when it comes to the president and everybody else? Because sovereign immunity needs to exist, right? Like when you're ordering drone attacks in Pakistan and, you know, you've got Homeland Security at your disposal and whatever. Like obviously you need protection from just tons of lawsuits and et cetera for all the work that you do. We have all enjoyed this immunity in the different offices we do. When I worked at the UN, we had some version of this. When you were Secretary of State, I'm sure this was true too.
Yeah, like, I mean, I got sued constantly by name because they wanted to change ballot language, but like, it, you know, I didn't have to pay for my own lawyers, and when I left office, it didn't follow me. Like, they couldn't bankrupt me personally,
right?
And that kind of thing.
So the first person we need to blame for all this is Trump, because by and large, we don't really have to ask these questions because most of the time it's pretty clear what's policy and what's personal. And once you start mixing those things, you put us all in a bad position. But I do think this is a common sense test, right? You ask the average person on the street, well, you know, President Trump ordered a drone strike to kill an ISIS leader. Should he be sued or prosecuted? I mean, obviously there's some people who think he should be. Most people don't. They're like, that's what a president does, is they got to do those kinds of things. And we got to protect them from that kind of stuff. And you're like, okay, well, President Trump is calling up the Georgia Secretary of State and trying to get him to find some votes. Is that under the official duty of the president? And should be protected? No, like that's
Obviously
not his job. That's absolutely not his job. Like as
it's
president.
Abuse of power by a candidate for office. Like it's not complicated.
Right. Now, what Trump and his people will say is because he's president, it's the president's phone, it's the president's plane. Everything he does is in his official capacity. I mean, that's just BS, right? Like if he took a fork in his you know, in the White House and stabbed, you know, the vice president with it, that would be a presidential fork, but it would still be a private act, I would say, even if it was over a policy disagreement.
They literally can't decide whether or not, like him assassinating a rival, like the stuff Putin does, like I know there's been intelligence assessments now that say Putin may not have directly ordered the execution of Navalny, but let's say for a moment that it had, you know, forget that. He's clearly executed a bunch of other rivals. They're literally saying like he should have the same immunity as Putin. Like Putin, who has assassinated political rivals. They're saying, well, that's possibly an official act.
Yeah.
And you just don't need to have an argument about whether that's an official act. Like,
right.
You know what's an official act. It's
well, don't get me
a made-up controversy.
It's, by the way, this is the second time we're talking about pornography on this episode. It's what they, the standards of pornography, when you see it. This will be a record-breaking mention of pornography. We still have time. We still have another half the episode.
It's the first mention of pornography by way of analogy.
Yeah.
The other is just, it's part of the facts of the case.
Actually, in many ways, people will know it when they see it, we hope. But let's, and the Navalny thing is BS, by the way. Who cares whether he ordered, we said this at the time, it's like he put the guy in Siberia, right? It's like if I locked, Jamie, my buddy Jamie, in the basement of my building, and then he happened to not make it to, to the end of the week. I'd be like, I didn't order, So I hope Jamie's not listening to this. I don't know why Jamie came to mind. Sorry, Jamie.
I don't either.
All right. It's just, I don't know. I just tried to make it not something that was even weirder than that. But okay. This is why we love to go live. We're going to take an ad break. And we come back, we're going to talk about the MTG versus Speaker Johnson showdown. And then we'll talk about what's happening in college campuses all across the country. And more importantly, what might be happening in negotiations over a ceasefire. All this and more when we come back.
Typical children's vitamins are basically candy in disguise, filled with 2 teaspoons of sugar, unhealthy chemicals, and other gummy junk growing kids should never eat. That's why Hi-Ya was created, the pediatrician-approved superpowered chewable vitamin. While most children's vitamins are filled with 5 grams of sugar and can contribute to a variety of health issues, Hi-Ya is made with 0 sugar and 0 gummy junk, yet it tastes great and it's perfect for picky eaters. Hi-Ya fills in the most common gaps in modern children's diets to provide the full body nourishment our kids need with a yummy taste they love. Formulated with the help of nutritional experts, Hi-Ya is pressed with a blend of 12 organic fruits and veggies, then supercharged with 15 essential vitamins and minerals, including vitamin D, B12, C, zinc, folate, and many others to help support immunity, energy, brain function, mood, concentration, teeth, bones, and more. It's non-GMO, vegan, dairy-free, allergy-free, gelatin-free, nut-free, and everything else you can imagine. Hi-Ya is designed for kids of all ages and sent straight to your door so parents have one less thing to worry about. It's also fun to say, Hi-Ya. As you know, I'm a father, and I'm always on the lookout for the best possible vitamins for my child to take. I'm so happy I've come across Hi-Ya Health. The ingredients are amazing, and I don't have to worry about sugar or gummy junk because Hi-Ya Health is made without that stuff, and it's still able to keep that great taste. We've worked out a special deal with Hi-Ya for their best-selling children's vitamin. Receive 50% off your first order. To claim this deal, you must go to hiyahealth.com/majority. This deal is not available on the regular website, so go to hiyahealth.com/majority and get your kids the full body nourishment they need to grow into healthy adults.
All right. Well, Marjorie Taylor Greene is moving ahead, trying to oust Speaker Johnson. And she said earlier today that she's officially triggering the clock. I don't know how all this works to hold a referendum on Johnson's speakership next week. So I guess she's beginning the procedure. She gave a press conference in front of the Hill. Let's go to this clip.
We have a speaker, Mike Johnson, that we all, by the way, I elected him. I voted for that man. So I have every right to be standing here. It wasn't a choice of America. It was a choice within our Republican conference. And I voted for Mike Johnson because his voting record before he became speaker was conservative. He voted against funding Ukraine. He was solidly pro-life. He voted to secure the border. He voted to fight against Democrats, fight against the witch hunt against President Trump. But once he became speaker, he has become a man that none of us recognize. So I entered a motion to vacate, but I didn't call it for a vote. I was controlled. I was responsible. I was being conscious and caring about my conference and our majority. It was a warning to stop serving the Democrats and support our Republican conference and support our agenda.
I love it when you hear something like, he was one way until he had responsibilities. And now he seems to actually like do things not
By the way,
based on.
he's still all of those things.
He's
She
still all
didn't
of
give
those
any
things.
evidence to
Yeah,
like
he's pro-Ukraine now. He's
he killed the border
pro-Ukraine.
deal that we're talking about.
Yeah.
Right. He's continues to carry water for Trump. He's every bit as pro-life as he ever has been. Right. Like, let's not, like, settle down, MTG. Like, I think like what's interesting though is, she's probably crazy, but there's evidence every now and then that she's manipulative. Like, it's like,
yeah.
I could have been crazy, but I've been restrained.
Mhm.
And now here's what's going on. I'm like, well, that's not how crazy people talk. Crazy people are just crazy, right? Like, they just are wild and unpredictable and they can't control themselves. And she's like, oh, I can turn the crazy on whenever you want it. Well, if you're truly crazy, there's not a button to push,
It's interesting because, she and Lauren Boebert were really seen as the same for a long time. They came in at the same time. They, came from the same wing of the nut house. And what I think happened is that Lauren Boebert found that she always was solely, I think, interested in just being famous. And she was going to get there however she could. And it turned out, oh, there's an opportunity to get there by just, being this right-wing mouthpiece. And so she's continuing that, but also having to confront the fact that she has to get reelected. And then you've got Marjorie Taylor Greene, who I think came from, to be honest, a crazier place ideologically. I think she started in a much nuttier, like, was just sort of an online 4chan commenter type person, and then got to Washington and was like, these trappings are cool. And she decided she kind of wants the approval of some of these people. She got very excited about having a leadership position and even went along with McCarthy as a result because it gave her a title. And now, that's why I think you hear her saying things like, I'm trying to be responsible, acting as if she is a one woman, caucus in and of herself. And that's why I think the end of this is she just actually becomes more and more irrelevant. Which is a wonderful thing.
Yeah, it's weird because she's irrelevant, right? In a way, because in doing this, she's kind of empowered Democrats to have more of a say, right? Because now they have a small piece of Johnson's livelihood. So in many ways, all the things she's saying, she's accusing Mike Johnson of, she is solely responsible for, because it could have been, and this is a world we don't necessarily want, right? But could have been a world where only the Republicans matter and they're totally united, which has traditionally been true of Republicans. It's kind of how Democrats operated under Pelosi, right? They're always pretty united, even for all the things people say about Democratic disarray. Like, they're pretty tight and continue to be pretty tight on this kind of stuff.
People voted against Pelosi when she allowed them to.
Right.
She was like, politically, it is better for our caucus if you part with me.
Right.
And I have the votes to spare. It's very different.
Yeah. So she's done all of those things. I mean, but the thing is, like, what does she want? Does she want, like, she's on TV? She's on Majority 54. Obviously, she's made it. So,
right.
It's like we're not playing clips of Dan Crenshaw or whoever, I don't know. Crenshaw's the guy I mentioned. Like, I don't even know who.
Well, we're not playing clips of Massey, and Massey's the person who she's doing this with. Right. And I couldn't tell you what he looks like.
Right. Yeah. I could. Yeah. I don't know. I can tell you what the bottom part of his face looks like, because he's always in the background when she's like doing these, he's like Batman, like, I wouldn't know what he looks like.
Yeah. He regularly mistaken for Batman. I think this is a huge opportunity for Democrats in this election, because I think that they shouldn't. I don't think that Jeffries and the caucus should quietly do this. I think it should be, look, we disagree with Speaker Johnson on all sorts of things, but we are here to work together. We are here to get things done. So we will be supporting a Republican for Speaker of the House. I mean, just go out and make it like a civics lesson. This is the closest we have come in many years to a moment that would have happened on the West Wing, where it was something that could actually make you feel like the country can work, like it can work the way it was supposed to work in the first place, that it can make you feel idealistic. Now, there's going to be a hesitance to do that, because just as Marjorie Taylor Greene has been saying, she thinks, I don't think she's right, but she thinks she is putting certain Democrats in a vice by potentially exposing them to primaries for supporting Johnson. I think as long as she is the instigator of this, I don't think that's the case, because I think any Democrat who, somebody tries to, if you're thinking you're going to go primary your incumbent Democratic member of Congress by saying they voted for a Republican speaker, they have a very easy retort, which is, no, I voted against Marjorie Taylor Greene.
Right.
And so I don't think that's an issue, which means there is an opportunity for the Democratic Party to say, hey, we're putting the country first. We could throw the Republican Party deeper into disarray, but we have stuff to do and we're tired of this. So yes, we're going to support this person who we disagree with on pretty much everything so that the country can achieve some things. And what that means for people listening to this show is I really think that if you're going to talk about what's going on in Washington with anybody about this stuff, this is the example I would go to. I would say, look, in the last few decades, there has only been one time where an entire caucus, an entire party in the House of Representatives got behind a speaker of the other party in order to get things done. And it's this year, this election year, when nothing seems to work, the Democrats said, instead of watching them flail, we're just going to back this guy so that we can actually pass some stuff and do things for the country. That, I think, is a pretty amazing argument. And I think it also plays right into what has traditionally been Biden's brand. And that's very helpful because Biden, in order to mobilize his voters, is not able to lean into that brand in the same way this year because he has to be aggressive. He has to be out on the campaign trail fighting in a way that I don't think Joe Biden's ever had to do, or frankly, any president running for re-election has ever really done. And so I think this is really, really an opportunity.
Yeah, and I think, like, as we talked about, I think it was last week, stability is generally good for Biden. So anything we could do to say,
good point.
I don't even know what these resolutions are anymore, like funding the government, whatever. Like, there seems like every month there's like some kind of stopgap funding issue that we have. It's like, let's just get all of those done. And getting the aid out of Ukraine is a good example of, like, it's objectively, then that's the most important part, the right thing to do, but also it allows Ukraine to survive, right? And the last thing we need over the summer, for obviously first morally, but also politically, is Ukraine falling apart, right? Like in the middle of this war as we head into an election. Just even though the Republicans would be 100% responsible for that, they would then turn around and say Biden chaos, right? Like that's what they
of course. They wouldn't even have to say it because that's how it works now, is that when there is chaos, I mean, after the break in a minute, we're going to talk about the protests. And there's all sorts of reasons why that topic matters. But it being an election year, it matters so much more because it looks like chaos. And chaos is bad if you're in the White House.
Well, speaking of that, we'll take a break. When we come back, we'll talk all about the protests, but also the ceasefire deal that may be on the table right now, potentially some reasons for hope when we come back. Sick of the one-size-fits-all method, especially when it comes to your erectile dysfunctional treatment? Well, good news. Now you've got options with HIMS. HIMS is changing men's healthcare, providing access to affordable sexual health treatments from the comfort of your couch. They provide access to doctor-trusted ED treatment options such as chewable hard mints, brand-name treatments like Viagra, or generic alternatives for up to 95% cheaper. The process is simple and 100% online. No uncomfortable doctor's visits. So answer a series of questions from their site, and a medical provider will determine the right treatment option. If prescribed, your medication ships to you for free. No insurance needed. So if ED is getting you down, it's time to join hundreds of thousands of trusted HIMS subscribers and get treated. Start your free online visit today at hims.com/majority. That's HIMS, HIMS.com/majority for your personalized ED treatment options. HIMS.com/majority. Hard mints are chewable compounded products which are not approved or verified for safety or effectiveness by the FDA. Prescriptions require an online consultation with a healthcare provider who will determine if appropriate. Restrictions apply. See website for details and important safety information. Subscription required. Prices vary based on product and subscription plan. All right, Jason. So a lot happening in the sort of Israel-Palestine world right now. What are you laughing about? It's such a serious topic. What's so funny to you, Jason?
Nothing. Just keep going. You're doing great.
Okay. Serious face has nothing to do.
I'm sorry.
With the topic we're about to discuss. So it's a side joke, everybody. All right, listen. There's a couple of housekeeping items before we talk about this stuff. Number one, a lot of people like rightfully raised the question, why do these protests matter? Why are we talking about the protests so much? Why are we giving them so much oxygen? And I think there are subcomponents of that argument. One of them is, well, when we could be talking about the conflict itself. And I just could not agree more when it comes to the conflict part. And we're going to spend some time in this segment talking about an actual ceasefire agreement that's on the table. But my case for why this matters is a couplefold. Number one, this is a significant portion of young people in this country at college campuses are taking steps that they haven't taken before on behalf of an issue. And usually these types of things define a generation. I talked about this in a different setting, but the Iraq war protests, and I don't think these are equivalent, which I'll get to, but the Iraq war protests defined my time at college. It was the first protesting I ever did. I went to the UN to protest the Iraq war when Colin Powell was trying to rally the Security Council to support the Iraq war. And that, you could draw a line from that activism that I did to supporting Obama. And so much of our generation, that was true. That protest defined that generation. And obviously, Jason, for you, going to fight in these wars, the other part of it defined your experience with this generation. So it matters in that sense. It also matters, obviously, because we're trying to make meaning out of it, and it becomes a mechanism for us as a country to debate other issues like identity politics and like subcomponents of the critical race theory argument, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, American foreign policy, right? Like support for Biden, right? These are all things that we kind of smuggle through this issue. And so it's almost this battleground where we've got all these advancing armies and they collide in this one valley, right? And this valley at the moment happens to be these protests. So that's why I think it matters. So maybe I'll just pause there and say, I think it's important to talk about.
I think, so I listened to the podcast you did on the Lost Debate about this, and I thought it was really good. And there were a lot of really important points that you made. And what you're sort of alluding to here is that one of them, before we even get into like what we think about this and what we think about the point of view of the protesters and all that, one of them is that while we have been sort of sleeping on the idea that free speech, and of course we mean it in a colloquial, not in a literal constitutional way, free speech on college campuses has been constrained, at least over the last several years, when it's like certain speakers can't show up and there's less free debate on issues. I think you make a great point in that episode about the idea that this is what happens as a result, is that when there is no place for these conversations to happen in a way, like when I was in college, and I think you experienced the same thing, it was like we had speakers come in who were highly controversial. I remember Pat Robertson came to American University, and I remember I went and I watched the speech. I sat in, it was like held, he didn't draw that big of a crowd actually, so it was held in like the chapel. So there were like 200 people there. And I remember that there were things like, there were students from like the LGBT Students Association who sat in the front and wore t-shirts that were, we didn't have the terminology then, but basically to troll him, right? And that was all fine. Like there was no violence, there was no, and it was, and we had, and then we would have, other speakers. I saw Jesse Jackson there. I saw, actually, interestingly, Donna Brazil, who I ended up later working with, like all sorts of people like that. And there was no, I don't remember there being this person cannot come to campus movement. And I never really knew what I thought about that. Like over the last several years, there were people who had very strong opinions on the idea of certain folks not being allowed to come to certain campuses to speak. And I never really knew what I thought, but I do now, because now I feel like that's been a mistake because it bottles everything up and there's no outlet for actual debate. And then we land in this spot.
Yeah. And I think just to, we're recording this at 2:44 p.m. Eastern time on Wednesday. And some of the biggest developments just over the past 24 hours is, so much of the attention is on Columbia. The university gave a 2 p.m. deadline. I think it must have been yesterday, right? Yesterday, for students to clear the green that they'd been camping out on. And not only did that not happen, or was it the day before, but the students, a certain group of students, and according to Mayor Adams and people I've heard from in the NYPD, it's students plus outsiders from outside the university broke into Hamilton Hall, one of the main sort of halls in Columbia University, and barricaded themselves in there, broke some windows, all this kind of stuff. And let's go to some clips from this. The NYPD then eventually cleared that hall, and this happened overnight.
Members of the NYPD rolled in on a Bearcat, then entered through the windows of Hamilton Hall one by one, carrying zip ties and riot shields to clear out protesters who breached the building on Tuesday morning. Columbia administrators gave officers the green light to enter campus and make dozens of arrests after demonstrators held 2 weeks of intense pro-Palestinian demonstrations and set up a massive tent encampment. The NYPD initially said officers wouldn't step foot on school grounds until it was asked to do so. Well, yesterday, the university did just that. A school spokesperson writing in a statement after the university learned overnight that Hamilton Hall had been occupied, vandalized, and blockaded, we were left with no choice. Video taken beyond the front gate shows officers breaking up a line of protesters who formed a human chain outside Hamilton Hall and yanking away metal tables and chairs used to block the entrance. Once inside the building, cops removed more furniture, climbed the stairs, and used hammers to unlock doors.
Yeah, so obviously this is a really troubling development. I think you can kind of separate all of this into different phases. And there's been massive unrest at UCLA, which we can get to if we have time, last night, where there was a clash between the pro-Palestinian protests and the pro-Israeli protests that turned what seems like pretty violent. There's conflicting accounts as to how violent it was, but certainly there are images of people hitting each other with all kinds of items, and no police anywhere in sight, which seems like an issue. Like, I'm just curious, like Hamilton Hall is where the Vietnam protests, for instance, in Columbia happened in '68. It's where a lot of the key sort of and students had like barricaded themselves in there, from what I understand, for a period of time there. And during the anti-apartheid movement, that also, that hall was also occupied. So how Columbia let this happen is a whole other question. That's another podcast. But there are different phases of this, right? There is the peaceful demonstrations, chants, all that, no matter what the chants say, is that allowed? Should that be allowed? That's one part of the debate. Then there's another part of the debate, which is like breaking and entering into a building on campus and barricading yourself into it, and a building that's, to be used by other tuition paying members of the community and professors and everybody else, I think is a different conversation. But you've heard my spiel on this before. I think there's so much attention to, should they be allowed to protest? Should they not be allowed to protest? And not enough attention to, well, what are they asking for? And let's engage in a dialogue with a younger generation. Like, you say this, I have a different opinion. I think they've been deprived of this back and forth because universities seem to be doing a poor job of creating the conditions for these kinds of debates and discussions.
Yeah, it's interesting being in Missouri and having, lived through Ferguson. I was Secretary of State during Ferguson. And then immediately after that, I was running for the U.S. Senate. So as a result, I was going around the country raising money, largely in more liberal places. I was constantly met with this debate that I had to, I felt like I was constantly put in this position where I had to defend my state as not super racist based on the fact that there were protests on the campuses. There were protests in Ferguson. And I remember always coming down on this place where I was like, well, if it were popular, they wouldn't be protesting, right? So why is everybody acting like the fact that these protests exist is a reflection of my entire state? And so it's very much immunized me for the most part against what would be, I'm turning 43 on Saturday. I'm a white guy from the middle of the country. What would be, even for a liberal, the more traditional knee-jerk reaction, which is, well, what are what they're doing it in the wrong place. They're doing it, they're picking the wrong time, which is, I don't know why certain hand gestures get celebratory balloons on StreamYard, but that's such an odd thing to have happen right there. But anyway, I don't understand. Like I'm not going to that place. I'm going to the place of like, well, yeah, if I go back in time and I look at the Vietnam War, if I look at apartheid, I would hope I wouldn't take that position. So I agree with you. I think it's, well, what is it that they're asking for, and is what they're asking for reasonable? If, regardless of where you stand, if you believe that this is a genocide, and if you, as they clearly do, well, then you have to get to the point where, well, protesting makes a lot of sense. But then you make an excellent point, which is in the other podcast where you talked about how, well, the UN is right there in New York City. So wouldn't that be a more consequential place to protest? A place like the United Nations. And then even I've been somebody who has been very against the BDS movement, the boycott, divestment movement. But if I look at it from their perspective, and if it is, about trying to stop a war from happening, and I can see the argument from their perspective of saying, well, what we have available to us is to try and persuade our university, because that's what we are. We're students. I get that. But at the same time, the idea that the university should take a position on a war happening, in a foreign land, I can't get down with that. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me, because I don't want to see the university take the position of being like, we are with Netanyahu. Like, I don't want that either. And so it all makes me very uncomfortable and makes me feel personally very in the middle.
Yeah, I'll tell you where I am on this, which is I think any peaceful demonstrations should be allowed. I do think there's a time, place, and manner thing, especially when it comes to tuition that's $66,000 a year, and I think students should have a right to go to class. I think they should have a right to use the facilities of the university. I think they should have a graduation in the most beautiful part of campus. It's private property. I also think that when you break into a building, especially when you're not a member of the university community, which some of these people appear not to be, you should be arrested for that, right? I have all sorts of positions on all sorts of political things. If somebody wants to protest outside my window here on Atlantic Avenue, go for it. You walk into my apartment and you protest, I'm going to have you arrested, right? And I know that universities are different, and I do think that they should make sure that there's space for this to happen. Now, what that space is, honestly, is from the university community to debate, right? I don't think that needs to be a national conversation. But what I do think is a national conversation is, well, there seems to be some unifying messages of the protests, and then there seem to be some messages that may or may not be representative of all of the protesters, but seem to be representative of enough of them that they should clarify these things, right? And I think when I see images like videos at Columbia, which right outside the gates, of huge crowd chanting "Hamas make us proud, take another soldier out, burn Tel Aviv to the ground," a city of 400,000 people, that is a pro-war statement, right? These are not anti-war statements. So when you try to connect yourself to the Iraq War or the Vietnam War protests, you're actually not in our company. You're actually advocating for war.
Yeah, it's like a Vietnam protest that's like, go Viet Cong.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's just fundamentally different, right? And you could make your argument, but don't call yourself a peaceful protest in that sense. I mean, you may be peaceful in your methods, some of them, but you're not advocating for peace. Second is, one leader after another has said really crazy things, like Kaimani Jones, who is the leader of the Columbia students who had to resign recently. Beginning of last week is, leading their press conferences. By the end of the week, it comes out that he had just said a couple months before on his own video that he posted that he wants to kill all Zionists, and filmed his own disciplinary hearing with the university where he would do cutaways to say, yeah, I mean every bit of this. People could look at the video. It's crazy. And he was a leader of this group. There's tons of examples of this. If you look for Students for Justice for Palestine, they believe, you could just look this up on their platform. They've been around for a long time. They believe in the total destruction of Israel's state by any means, including through violence. There are instances one after another where even super pro-Palestinian people like Norman Finkelstein had to show up to Columbia and plead with protesters not to say from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. He tried to say, hey, use Palestinians will be free as people, not the country, because that has connotations, right? Mm-hmm. Even remember the guy I had on my podcast from Gaza, who's lost multiple family members in Gaza. He tweeted out yesterday, he retweeted something I put out there, and he's very anti-Hamas. He hates that these protesters are like in any way talking about Hamas as anything other than a death cult that is super like ultra right wing and horrible, right? People could listen to that episode if they want. He's very clear on it. This is not a pro-Israeli person. And he talks about how the protesters at Colombia are cosplaying. And he's like, look, when they asked for humanitarian aid, he's like, look, my family, they've knocked down all of our homes. My family is starving to death. This is a joke, right? And so this is
you should point out what you mean when you say they asked for humanitarian aid.
Oh yeah, so there's a clip we can actually go to. It's a very short clip of a young woman outside of Hamilton Hall. Right, this was before obviously the police stormed in, where they did a press conference where they were asking for food. Now they were asking to be able to bring in their own food, I think, and get it delivered somehow through their people. But let's go to this clip.
Do you want students to die of dehydration and starvation or get severely ill, even if they disagree with you? If the answer is no, then you should allow basic, I mean, it's crazy to say because we're on an Ivy League campus, but this is like basic humanitarian aid we're asking for. Like, could people please have a glass of water?
I mean, I don't want anybody to start, but you broke into a building that I think has running water, by the way, but you broke into a building and you were there for a few hours. My grandfather joined Gandhi's movement. Gandhi starved himself to near death to try to protest against violence. Again, against violence, to try to get Hindus and Muslims to get along with each other. He nearly starved himself to death to make a point. My grandfather had a shoot-on-sight order from the British, gave up the family business importing British cloth, was away from his family for years for that cause. Couple hours without Uber Eats. Let's settle down. Okay.
I think the lesson here is, bring snacks, like pack a lunch.
But here on a serious note, right?
Yeah.
There's actually way more common ground amongst reasonable people, right? You've got some people in your life, you and I have, you have a relative who I am very fond of, who I think is probably way more critical of Israel, even though I think you and I are very critical of Israel. It doesn't always show, but because I get more animated sometimes I get animated by some of these things. But what's clear is I don't know how many times we've said Netanyahu has no goals for this conflict. What he's doing is inhumane. It's for his own narrow political interests. It's not in the best interest of Israelis or Palestinians. And I think we're very clearly on board with ceasefire and some kind of permanent state for Palestinian people. And we don't want anybody else to die in this conflict. We want the hostages to be released. We don't see the wisdom of continuing this campaign. And there is an actual ceasefire agreement on the table right now that is now in Hamas's hands, where Israel will do a 40-day ceasefire in exchange for the exchange 30 hostages. And a reminder, these are hostages, not prisoners of war, which is an important distinction. And it's now in Hamas's hands. And so what would be really powerful? Well, if instead of people beating each other up across picket lines, it would be great if these people were calling on Colombia to embrace a ceasefire, would actually call on Hamas to accept a ceasefire agreement. Because you know what doesn't matter? What Colombia thinks about a ceasefire. You know what does matter? What Hamas thinks about the ceasefire, right? And then you and I, who I think like I don't like the label pro-Israeli or whatever, but like I think a lot of people listening to this who are more sympathetic to the protesters would characterize as such. We should do what we've been continuing to do, which is to continue to push Netanyahu to issue a ceasefire. Obviously, this has some effect on the Democratic politics, where there are a lot of Democratic politicians who are doing this as well. Biden has definitely said he's not on board with the Rafah campaign. And so we do our part and say, all right, let's push people who are closer to what we believe to agree to a ceasefire. Protesters, instead of worrying about what the president at Columbia University thinks, maybe you should like direct it to Hamas, because if they opened the BBC and instead of people like tearing each other apart, the signs are actually directed at Hamas, that could make a difference. You know?
Or directed at Hamas and Netanyahu. Like, because what we don't want is to come across as those people who, like the folks who got upset about people in Ferguson and said, well, you need to stand up against criminality in your own community, right? Like, that's not what we're saying. We're saying like directed at the people who are actually on both sides of this. What has really struck me over the last few days is the way in which the term Zionist has now just shifted in the lexicon. Like they have worked very hard and how I think, most Americans before this had no idea what a Zionist was. And I think if you were to ask the average American if Zionism is, synonymous with being pro-genocide against Palestine, I think most would think that it is, because that's how it's been talked about. And
Yeah.
I just want to be clear, like, the Oxford Dictionary of Zionism of a Zionist is a person who believes in the development and protection of a Jewish nation in what is now Israel, which is in no way mutually exclusive with wanting a Palestinian state. It's in no way mutually exclusive with thinking Netanyahu is horrible and probably a war criminal and needs to go, because I would consider myself a Zionist who believes all of those things.
Well, this is where I think like we need to have a discussion with the people who believe these things. This is what debate is all about, right? And obviously this was what the whole series I did for my podcast was about. And it wasn't pro this or pro that. It just went through the history of what does it mean to be all these things, right? And what's clear is that what separates like I'm sitting in in Brooklyn and I've lived in Manhattan where the Algonquins were, et cetera. Like that is a straight up, like there is a line of colonialism that you could point to where I'm sitting right now. Right. Well, with the Jews in Israel, it's much more complicated because they're kind of the first people who were there. That doesn't end the discussion, but that changes the colonial narrative. Now, they arrived in that area and they started buying up land. That's where the word Zionist came from. And at the time, there were a small group of people mostly fleeing persecution, which were pogroms in Russia, and then eventually, obviously, the Holocaust. What's weird to me, and where I would want to debate and discuss with these young people, is, look, you don't have to believe anything that comes after that is right or wrong and all that. And the history I did, it's very depressing. But to say things like what that kid said, which is all Zionists deserve to die, or what the head of the University of Michigan group said, which was, she said, until my last breath, I will utter death to every single individual who supports the Zionist state. Death and more, death and worse. By the way, worse? What's like, what are you trying to do? Torture people? But like I would want to be like, look, you're here in the United States. I'm here in the United States. Like, not all the great things happen to get us here. But you have to start the clock somewhere. The Jews who are actually in Israel actually have a longer claim to the land underneath their feet than a lot of people do. That's not the end of the discussion. That doesn't mean you should build settlements in the West Bank. That doesn't mean that you should invade Rafah. It doesn't mean any kid should be killed in this war, right? None of that presupposes anything you believe about lines or anything like that. But like a group of people who believe that they deserve a state doesn't make them Nazis. And you also don't even have to believe they deserve a state. Like, you don't have to agree with that. But to call them Nazis is such a crazy leap to me that it tells me that these people aren't used to anybody disagreeing with them, So, yeah.
All right. Well, we'll obviously settle this next week. We'll resolve
we'll solve the conflict.
We're almost
But the good
there.
news is there is a ceasefire agreement on the table right now. People are discussing it as we speak. David Cameron's at the table. Blinken's at the table. The Qataris, the Saudis are at the table, and apparently Hamas has sent a delegation. And this is where we find out, is Hamas interested in peace? Or do they, as my friend from Gaza said on my podcast the other day, do they benefit from this in the way that Netanyahu tends to benefit from the war prolonging, which has been my theory all along, is that Hamas and Netanyahu have a lot of common ground on that, which is why we all have to unify behind the things that we have in common instead of tearing each other apart over whether this part of the grass in front of Columbia University or that part of the grass is the right place to have this discussion.
Because otherwise we're all getting played by Hamas and Netanyahu. Basically.
For sure.
Yeah. So, okay. One for us. What's going on?
I thought I was going to play this clip, but we're running out of time. I thought that the Collin Jost.
Oh, play it.
Oh, yeah, let's play it.
Yeah,
There's a Staten Island moment at the White House Correspondents' Center, so let's play this.
But Staten Island firefighters are not normally your demographic. Staten Island voted about 70% for Trump in the last election, and the other 30% was for Giuliani. But Staten Island also sided with the British during the Revolutionary War. So we're not always on the right side of history. You remember. But my grandfather a Staten Island firefighter, voted for you, Mr. President. He voted for you in the last election that he ever voted in. I mean, I'm sure someone else will vote twice in this election using his name, but that's just how the Democratic machine works. He voted for you, and the reason that he voted for you is because you're a decent man. My grandpa voted for decency, and decency is why we're all here tonight. Decency is how we're able to be here tonight.
I thought that was a beautiful moment, and
I could
I
have
didn't
done
even realize
without
it was
the.
up to 70% in Staten Island, by the way. That's
I
good
I
lord.
could have done without the Democratic machine joke. I feel like
Yeah,
once
I
you-
actually think that was. He was on a roll.
yeah, it interrupted the role because he had already made the age joke about Biden, so he had already balanced it out.
Right.
And
But I thought it was a great moment. I didn't realize it was up to 70% in Staten Island. It doesn't totally surprise me.
I
This
didn't
is a
know the
place that
thing about the
voted-
Revolutionary War. That's amazing.
Yeah, there's a lot of history there. Actually, the church that my mom is a leader at, St. Andrew's Episcopal, was actually used as an infirmary for British soldiers.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, it's crazy.
So maybe it was captured by the
yeah.
Brits more so than sided with. But either way,
No, they did side, but I
They
think
s-
it's
they
one
sided
in
with
the,
them?
it's like related, right? Because it's like you kind of like you bend the knee, like basically you're like whoever's got the
yeah,
guns.
they were there. They beat
yeah,
them. They beat the Union Army to Staten Island.
yeah.
Well, yeah, I think that's a nice one for us. What I would throw in is I don't know if Salty is still, if he can come onto the microphone, but I was just, our producer, Salt, and I was watching his Instagram, and he put up like his stats from a run, and this dude, he did 10 miles in an hour and 9 minutes. He's running at a sub 7-minute pace, 10
Oh my God.
miles. And, we only ever see him from about the shoulders up on here. But apparently he's quite the endurance athlete. And I was just he told me that he's training for a half marathon. And he told me the time he's trying to hit, he's clearly going to hit it. And I just felt like we should acknowledge, I mean, my baseball season just started. I'm about to turn 43, and like I am working very hard to have my legs not feel like concrete, and be able to play a couple of games a week, like doing a lot to do that. And anyway, I didn't know we had like this pretty incredible runner in our midst. I just
That's
wanted
amazing
to shout
time.
it out. Oh, he's in the chat. He says, thanks you for the shout out, but he won't come on and accept these flowers. And that's totally fine. So, all right. Thanks everybody for listening. Please leave a 5-star review. You can find myself and Ravi on social media. I'm at Jason Kander. He's at Ravi M. Gupta. Thank you to the Midas Mighty. Remember, we all have a platform. Make sure to use yours today.